Today we're talking about lesson 2.4, and you wrote down the learning goal in your notebook, which is to use a model to form a mental strategy for multiplication. So today we're going to be using models, and by that I don't mean supermodels or car models, I mean pictures, math pictures, right? And we're going to use these math pictures to help us think about what we can be thinking about in our head to help us with multiplication, okay? It doesn't mean when it says mental strategy, it doesn't mean do everything in your head. You need to draw the picture to show me what's going on in your head. Okay? Ben, you got that? Yeah. Great. Let's talk about the problem of the day. So if we're doing this problem, and go ahead and write it down in your notebook, 8 times 31. That's like saying I have 31 copies of 8, right? If I drew a tape diagram, these dots right here mean it keeps going and it ends with an 8, and altogether I have how many 8s? 31 8s. Is it easier to do 31 times 8, have 31 copies of 8, or to have 30 copies of 8? 30. Right. So what you can do right underneath is you can draw another tape diagram, and you can see all that's missing is how many copies of 8? Right? There's one copy of 8, 1 8 there. Actually, I'm going to write it like this. 1 8, that's missing. So let's solve that. If I have 30 copies of 8, how many do I have? What's 30 times 8? Well, I can use my math facts. I know 3 times 8 is what? 3 times 8 is? 24. And how many factors of 10 do I have in my factors? 1. So that means I have to add how many zeros? 1. But is that my final answer? No, it's missing what? 1 copy of 8, otherwise known as how many? 8. So all I need to do is I need to do 240. And I need to add how much to it? 1 copy of 8. And so what's 240 plus 8? 248. And so therefore, 8 times 31, when I have 31 copies of 8, is 248. So do you guys see how we drew another tape diagram right underneath, right here, that was easier for us to think about, and we just added or subtracted the difference? Yeah. In this problem, 29 times 8, it says I have 29 copies of 8. Or this one says I have 8 copies of 29. Which one's easier to think about and why? 8 copies of 28 or 29 copies of 8 or 8 copies of 29? Vasisht?
8 copies of 29 because it's a lesser number than 29 copies of 8.
Interesting. But when I draw a picture here I drew 30 copies of 8. Is 29 copies of 8 easier to think about because it's pretty close to 30 copies of 8? Mm-hmm. If I did 8 copies of 29, is 8 close to any number that's easy for me to work with?
Yeah. 10.
It's pretty close to 10, but I would have to subtract how many copies of 29 later?
16.
How many copies?
8.
If I change this to be 10 copies of 29, how many extra copies of 29 do I have? So can we do 2 times 29 in our head? We could, or is it easier if I change this one to 30 copies of 8 to subtract 1 copy of 8? Which one's easier?
30.
This one, right? So go ahead and draw yourself a tape model that shows 30 copies of 8. Now, when I have 30 copies of 8, that's 30 times 8, we can use our math facts. I know that 3 times 8 is 24, and I have 1 factor of 10, so I'll add 1 0. But is my actual tape model, do I need to have 30 copies of 8? How many copies of 8 am I actually trying to have? 29. So right under your 30 copies of 8, draw a tape model. And you don't actually have to draw 29. What you can do is just go like this and show that each one of these has 8. And you say dot, 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 dot. It continues on, and it ends with another copy of 8. If you do that, this is called shorthand. What you have to do, though, is you have to label that all together you have 29 copies of 8s. Okay. Now, comparing these two tape models, this one has something extra, doesn't it? How many extra copies of 8 are there in the 30 copies of 8? 1. So there's 1 extra copy of 8. So that means, what do I need to do to this 240? I need to subtract, I need to make it shorter by 1 copy of 8. So I need to subtract 8. Does that make sense? What's 240 minus 8? 232. We can do that in our head. So therefore, 29 copies of 8 is 232.